So, again, rather conveniently, the seventh stage of contemplation is quite short. And it's a rather difficult one, I think, for contemporary people to understand. It seems a little esoteric or a little abstract, and maybe it is in some ways. It basically, he says that as we move along and through these stages of contemplation, you remember we move through the ascetical, we move through the sense of fallenness, of our own incapacities, our own limitations, our own problems. And then we move through the ascetical stages into a greater freedom of the heart, where we become capable of feeling contrition. It's as if our sensitivity, our spiritual sensitivity is restored or reawakened. And we begin to see the meaning of the purification of the heart. And in the fourth stage, we become able to focus upon the mystery of Christ. And we are taught that it's through the practice of detachment that we are able to experience this mystery of Christ for ourselves, not only through books or but in the scriptures we are able to discover the hidden meanings, the hidden mysteries, and the mystery of Christ himself. And then in the fifth stage, we are introduced to the idea of impermanence, that the changeable nature of all created things is something that makes us reflect upon the meaning of death, to become mindful of death, and to discover that by practicing the mindfulness of death in the right way, we overcome our weakness, our fear, our tendency to postpone or to avoid. In the sixth stage, after we have learnt the habit of detachment, we discover strength, the ability to look on beauty without passion, without attachment, to withdraw our positive and negative attachments from things, and to be moved, therefore, along into the contemplation of nature, as we discover our own capacity for divinization. And this is the real awakening of the sense of wonder, the wonder of the magnificence of the world, of creation, and the greatest wonder of all, the incarnation itself. So Christian faith, as it were, begins to flower within this experience of the beauty of creation. And self-knowledge and spiritual knowledge begin to develop together. Now, in this seventh stage, he says we begin to marvel not only at the beauties of the world and the diversity of creation, or at our own being, the depth and subtleties of our own existence, but we begin to marvel at the multiple states of being, the multitude of incorporeal powers which are beyond the material realm. So the angelic powers and thrones, the levels of reality, we would probably say, which we are not usually able to discern. They require too sensitive or a much more sensitive or a much more pure kind of vision to be able to be aware of them, although we may have a dim sense, a certain intuition that there are other layers and levels of being. But he says in the seventh stage we begin to experience an expanded sense of wonder at these multiple states of being, and we find peace beyond our thoughts. We find a peace that is beyond the operations of our mind and ordinary consciousness. So I don't propose to go into a description of how he sees these different levels of angelic beings, because I think those are quite peculiar to the language of his time, and we would have to think quite long and hard about how we understood those intuitions in our own language. But I think what may be worth thinking about is how we relate, and this is perhaps what he's saying here, how we relate the interior levels of experience, which have many different levels too, to our behavior, to the way we live. What is the resonance between my way of life and how I'm living, and how I deal with problems and situations and relationships with the interior life? And I think meditation here clearly becomes of great importance. And as Leonardo begins his novitiate this evening, he's committing himself, or undertaking in this coming year, to reflect in the community on the three great precepts of Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict has quite a simple way of welcoming people into the community. He says, let them come, keep them in the guest house for a few days to make sure they're not out for the family silver, or test their spirits a little bit. And then you bring them into the community, you read the rule of Saint Benedict to them, which is this quite short document, the rule of Saint Benedict. It's a small little document, but it's I think 14,000 words, if I'm not mistaken. But it's probably had, as after the Bible, it was the most influential text on Western society, because of course it inspired the monasteries, the Benedictine monasteries, the way of life. Benedictinism never really took root in Ireland, because the Irish are too extreme. And Benedict's great principle is moderation in all things except moderation. And the Celtic monks were much more inclined to go for the extremes. And it was a great tragic loss to the Western Church that the Celtic Church became suppressed almost by the Roman Church. But anyway, in the rule of Saint Benedict, we find a beautiful expression of the Christian life lived in community. It was written for lay people. Saint Benedict was not a priest. Monastic life in this period was not clericalized. It's one of the ways in which the institutional church kind of tamed the monastic movement was by clericalizing it. And monks do not necessarily, and perhaps even shouldn't be, priests. I mean, they can be, and there's a good reason for some of them to be priests as well. But it's really there are different kinds of vocation or calling. But for Benedict, it was a lay community, living a life focused very seriously upon the stages of contemplation, moving through a life of order and balance and charity and concern for others and respect for the poor, for the weak, for the sick, for the young, for the old, especially people who need special help, or the stranger who turns up in the middle of the night and wants a bed. it's a way of life that is really expressing the spirit of the gospel. It's not theorizing about it, it's not a theological document. And of course, because it was written in the 6th century or so, it needs to be interpreted, and every Benedictine monastery or community, such as the Oblate community we have in London, interprets it according to its circumstances. If you're living in the spirit of the rule in the middle of London, it's different if you're living it on Bere Island or living it in the middle of the desert. But the essential elements of the rule are universal, and after the new candidate has been brought into the monastery, he's read the rule, and during the year that follows he listens to the rule 3 times, so he knows what the spirit of the life is, what the precepts or what the values, we might say, of the life are really about. And these are expressed in quite, graphic terms, really. You pick up the spirit of the life, the spirit of the rule of life, through the ways in which he speaks about the clothing of the monks, or the questions of discipline and authority, the care of the sick brothers, the elderly and the children, how you organize the readers for the week, keeping silence at certain times, what you're supposed to eat and when you're supposed to eat it. And with all of these rules, it's not like the highway code. So with the highway code, there are no exceptions. If it says keep to the speed limit of 100 kilometers an hour, that's the rule, and if you break it, you get punished if you get caught. But with the rule, nearly in all these cases, he imagines exceptions to the rule. So he says, in no circumstances should the monks speak after compline, so to keep the silence of the night. However, if there's something really serious, and the abbot thinks that he says that there's something that needs to be done, or a guest arrives, then of course you use your common sense and you break the rule. But there's this constant flexibility and the building of exceptions around these particular rules. And it's not weakening the rule, it's actually strengthening it, because it's giving you the opportunity to practice discretion. For Benedict, the discretion is the mother of all virtues. And maybe some people have more discretion than others. But hopefully, in the life that you live in the spirit of the rule, you develop this quality of good judgment, of common sense, infused with kindness and a particular concern for those in need. So the newcomer is brought into the monastery, given someone to look after him, and then he just lives the life. And he's monitored during the year, and then at the end of the year, he's in the rule. He says, "Okay, now do you want to stay or not? You're free to go, you're free to stay. You know what it's about." And it's really living the life that forms you and teaches you. Doesn't matter how many psychological assessments you have before, or all these things. In the end, you get to know somebody by living with them, and they get to know whether this is the right way of life. Well, it seems to me a bit strange that the Church doesn't have something similar, like a novitiate for marriage. But although it hasn't done that, the rest of society has provided for it today pretty well. So anyway, so this is for the becoming a monk. An oblate follows the same principle, follows the same rule, but in different circumstances. You may be living in community, as Leonardo is this year, in London, or some of the people here who I'll ask to come round when we start the oblation ceremony are Paul and Judy, married couple living in Sydney, and Susan living in London, in England, and Kath living in Brisbane, and others, and Henriette living in the community in London, so on. So there are many different ways of living this out. Wojciech recently married and living in London after having spent a couple of years in the Oblate community in London.
Stefan.
And Stefan. Stefan, how do you? Oh my God! All right, I'm sorry.
No.
Yes, I think actually everyone is an Oblate. So there are many ways of living the rule, and it's not the only rule you could live by. But most people, I think, like to feel that they are living by some set of standards or values or guidelines. You might write these for yourself, or you might combine your own values and guidelines and standards with things you picked up elsewhere. And even in following the rule, you still have to use your discretion and adapt it. And I think for the meditator, in particular, after you've been meditating for some time, you begin to see that meditation is not just a method of prayer. It becomes or opens up into a way of life. And the kind of changes that meditation brings into your life are pervasive. I mean, they touch every aspect of your life, your relationships, your work, your relationship with yourself, your sense of the idea of God in your life, and what religion means, and what the church means. So, I think when you are aware of that change taking place, it's then in particular that it can be helpful to reflect upon a rule of life, or the guidelines, or the values, or the precepts by which you're living. Now, Benedict has 3 precepts that he says to the monk or to the oblate. These are your vows, and he doesn't use the word, well, he does use the word vows, or precepts. And they are stability in the community especially, stability, obedience, and conversion of life. Once, some years ago, when the Dalai Lama was at our invitation speaking to a large group of Benedictine monks and nuns, we asked him to comment on the rule of St. Benedict and speak about the monastic life from that point of view, and he didn't know that much about it, but so we had a little crash course on the rule of St. Benedict, and he's got a very quick mind, and he picked it up immediately. And he said of these 3 precepts, the one that's most Buddhist is conversion. Because conversion represents a commitment to, or an openness to, continuous change. Being open to continuous change. That's what allows us to go through these stages of contemplation. Otherwise you get stuck. And it doesn't matter at what stage you get stuck, even a high stage, if you get stuck, you're stuck. And the picture that we've been looking at in Peter of Damascus is a dynamic experience of spiritual growth. It's not just climbing up and hanging onto a ledge and hanging on there, but it's a continuous process of letting go. So that's conversion. Stability is, in one sense, a physical stability to a community or as to a marriage. Doesn't mean you have to be locked up in the same house with your spouse for the rest of your life, but it means that that physical connection is real, is stable, and is something you are faithful to as far as you can. So that stability has a physical dimension, and there is also stability, conversion, and obedience. And obedience, obedience has a function within any group, a family, the authority of the parents, within a business or within the church or within an organization of any kind. So there's that vertical obedience, but he also says there has to be a horizontal obedience. The brothers must be obedient to each other. So a happy family is a family where all the children are listening to each other and not walking over each other, and the parents are listening to each other and to the children, not just imposing their will violently. So there's obedience is a very subtle and beautiful vow, really. It's not just doing what you're told in a military-like way. It's about tuning in to other people, what is best for them and what is best for the situation. Listening, we might say, to the Word of God, sounding in the relationships and circumstances of the day by day. Now, those three precepts or vows, stability, conversion and obedience, have this exterior dimension. They're things we use to shape our way of living. But I would say they also are connected with an interior life, and which meditation also makes apparent to us. And we could draw a link, I think, between the essential precepts of meditation, silence, stillness and simplicity. This is what we're practicing in the daily discipline of meditation. Silence, stillness and simplicity with conversion, stability and obedience. Stillness corresponds to stability. It's not running around during your meditation. There's the physical stillness, but there's also the interior stillness of letting go of our thoughts, of our desires and plans. And simplicity, I think, corresponds to obedience, because simplicity is another word for unity. When something is simple, it's one. And obedience, the purpose of obedience is not to subordinate yourself to somebody else. It's not a power struggle. Obedience is really the movement towards a union of wills, or union of minds, union of hearts. So simplicity is very much the fruit and the dynamic of obedience. And then silence, I think, relates to this vow of conversion. Conversion is listening and responding to the changing circumstances of our lives, and letting go when we have to let go, and persevering when we have to persevere. And silence is the quality of attention. It's that sensitivity, it's that awareness of what's happening in your life at any one moment, and recognizing the moment. We spoke the other day about the importance of recognition in the spiritual life, and really enlightenment is this process of recognition. So, and I think this is really kind of relevant to the seventh stage of contemplation, as Peter of Damascus calls it. It's a little more down to earth than his multiple states of being in the different angelic orders, but in a way it is pointing to the same spiritualization of life that doesn't lose its incarnate, physical, down-to-earth reality. But there is and as this spiritualizing process happens, we do become aware of more subtle levels of being and more sensitive ways of interacting with the world. So, would anyone like to raise any thoughts or share any haikus? Raise any questions? Anybody write any haikus just today? We only had one so far. That's not so. It's actually no haikus. You did? Oh, there's some in the back. Oh, could you get them? Thanks. Oh, sorry, I didn't have a chance to look. Oh, great. In the meantime, anybody got anything they'd like to share?
I have a question.
Please.
I'm a little bit nervous, but John Main in one of his talks he mentioned that if one views meditation simply as a means of relaxation, then the view is very limited.
Yes.
And that if you open it up from a religious point of view, that the view widens as well. Take somebody, I'll take myself as an example. If you ask me, am I a believer, I would ask you, believe in what? So from that point, it's like as if somebody told me something and I'd say, no, I don't believe that. That could never have happened. But then I find out for myself that it actually did happen. So then I believe in it. But up to that point, my belief would be very, okay, maybe. And from a point of view of fate, I don't know where my fate is because it's never been tested. So so I would describe myself as somebody who travels in hope rather than a firm belief or a very strong faith. And given that position, to what point then does meditation simply become a discipline and a daily routine within one's life? Have I made any sense in that question?
Yes, no, I think so. Yes, thank you. Well, maybe comment on it again in a minute, but I think meditation is a way of faith. It's pure faith. It's not about belief. You lay aside your beliefs, religious beliefs, theological beliefs. You don't reject them, but you are not concentrating on them or thinking about them or visualizing them or whatever during the meditation. So in a sense you could say you're leaving them to one side, or you could say that you're actually moving to a deeper level. But the level you're moving to is a way of is an experience of faith. Faith is distinct from belief. That your belief system, most people have some kind of belief system and find that necessary and valuable. But I think the belief system by which we live is there really to support, in a way, the journey of faith. Although the more we strengthen our muscle of faith, the more faithful we become, the more the beliefs that we have will be illumined. We may drop some of those beliefs. Some images of God will certainly go out of the window, and people will feel sometimes for a while, or get frightened, that they are losing their faith because these images of God are disappearing under the experience of faith. It's not that they're losing their faith, they're actually increasing their faith. But it's just the beliefs are being revamped, remodeled, and the bad ones, the wrong ones are thrown out. The ones that don't make sense. So faith is our capacity for commitment. That's where meditation is a discipline. It's our capacity for transcendence, taking our attention off ourselves and off the ego. And in that sense, it's our capacity for love, because love happens in that movement of transcendence. And so the tradition says the work of contemplation is the work of love. So we are doing the work of love actually in our daily meditation. It's the pure thing, it's the concentrated. So, I think that has its effects, and you could certainly measure the benefits of meditation, relaxation and stress reduction, and improving your cholesterol and your anger control, and improving your teeth and restoring your hair, and all the things that meditation is proven to do. In some cases, but there are also the spiritual fruits of meditation, which are less easy to measure, but which we actually do experience and come to recognize, especially in our relationships, and our way of living and working and relating to others in the world. And those spiritual fruits, love, the first one, joy, finding joy interiorly rather than just looking for happiness outside in the satisfaction of our desires or ambitions. Peace, finding that we can live with contradictions without anxiety, and finding peace. Patience, realizing that we are becoming less angry, fly off the handle less, we're less intolerant, we're more compassionate, have more empathy. So we notice those things eventually, although other people may notice them before we do. So I don't know if that addresses what you're saying. I think where you start, where we think we start, may not be so important. The important thing is that we do the practice, we do the work, and then allow the fruits to appear.
Well, I will continue to meditate, irrespective of what the response is. But I would describe you as a professional meditator, if you can take from that, just from that. And it's like somebody in a sport, they get to a certain level by being an amateur. But then they have a decision to make. Look, if you want to get to a higher level, then you've got to make a greater commitment to this and go on. And I feel I'm at a point, and it's not that I'm looking for anything extra from it, or I'm not looking for anything from meditation. But
so you're kind of you're saying you're at a kind of maintenance level.
Yes.
Yeah.
And and that's where I'm at. And my wife might argue with you on the point of my temper, etc., having become better, because when one has to go along with people and with a family and make difference, I question that. Where am I, basically? I don't. This doesn't make any sense to you.
Well, I did. You could just tell your wife it would be much worse if you didn't. But there is I met someone recently who told me that she'd been meditating for a year since I last saw her, and she'd been very faithful to it. She said, "I'm really grateful for having found it, and I'm going to stick with it." But she said, it hasn't brought me any of these nice fruits that you said it would bring. And she said, actually, it's made me worse. And she said, ask my family. She said, they all say to me, you're much worse since you've been meditating. You're flying off the handle, you're not as nice as you were, and bark at us much more. So she, I said, well, it's strange, really. And I said, were you always like this? She said, no, never like this. She said, I never, you know, lost my temper. I never expressed my anger. She said, in fact, she said, when we were growing up as girls in the family, our mother always used to tell us, never show your anger. Especially the girls. It's not ladylike. Just got to be quiet and endure it. You know, the men can rant and rave, but women are not allowed to. So I think that, you know, it's pretty obvious what was happening. That 40-year-old repression was beginning to lift. Meditation does that. Grace works on nature. The grace that she was opening herself to through meditation was working on her psychological nature. That repression was being lifted, and she hadn't yet quite got the knack of expressing her anger in the right way. Or maybe she was learning that. So I think, you know, I don't think that, to be honest, I think if you're meditating sincerely and faithfully, I don't think you are in the maintenance mode, really. I think you may be in a period where the fruits are not falling off the tree yet.
I don't look for that. You know, I suppose that is where my faith comes in. I'm just making myself present.
Yes.
And whatever happens, happens. I'm not looking for anything.
Well, I think that's excellent. Yes, that's good. And it's much better in terms of the fruits or the benefits of meditation. It's really much better to just let them come or go naturally without making that a focus of your attention. The more you take the attention off yourself, and the better. So not having that as your primary motivation is a good thing. It probably shows that you've started. The important thing is that you've just started. You're not checking the growth every 5 minutes. We have some. We have one in Irish.
Yes, English on the back.
Oh, English on the back. Who can read it in Irish? Poor Bere Island. Nobody on Bere Island speaks Irish. Yes? And you can read it in English on the back. Unum Doris Moshe Dahala. That's my only Irish sentence.
Minach Aniran sa vertical. Gasúra gáire na Madribug. Tramona J. March, Shachtan na Chaska. And that translates to the cow and the monk talking together. The breed of the island and both of them. A young lad laughing with a little dog. Tuesday evening, Easter week.
Alright. You want to read this one? Yes? You wrote it? You wrote it?
No.
Very short? Get short.
Detachment frees us from suffering. Suffering. Detachment frees us from suffering. It's not mine.
And the last one. Who's going to read the last one? Yes, last one.
This is when my shadow, a startled butterfly, took flight on white and orange wing.
Yes. Good. Well, the koans give us our transition to meditation and our reception of Leonardo as a oblate novice. In the ceremony, we present him with the copy of the rule and a medal, St. Benedict, and he signs this chart which describes the coming year. With the interior life. And I think meditation here clearly becomes of great importance. And as Leonardo begins his novitiate this evening, he's committing himself or undertaking in this coming year to reflect in the community on the three great precepts of St. Benedict. St. Benedict has quite a simple way of welcoming people into the community. He says, let them come, keep them in the guest house for a few days to make sure they're not out for the family silver, or test their spirits a little bit. And then you bring them into the community, you read the rule of St. Benedict to them, which is this quite short document, the Rule of St. Benedict. It's a small little document, but it's I think 14,000 words, if I'm not mistaken. But it's probably had, as after the Bible, it was the most influential text on Western society, because of course it inspired the monasteries, the Benedictine monasteries, the way of life. Benedictinism never really took root in Ireland, because the Irish are too extreme. And Benedict's great principle is moderation. He says in the seventh stage we begin to experience an expanded sense of wonder at these multiple states of being, and we find peace beyond our thoughts. We find a peace that is beyond the operations of our mind and ordinary consciousness. So I don't propose to go into a description of how he sees these different levels of angelic beings, because I think those are quite peculiar to the language of his time, and we would have to think quite long and hard about how we understood those intuitions in our own language. But I think what may be worth thinking about is how we relate, and this is perhaps what he's saying here, how we relate the interior levels of experience, which have many different levels too, to our behaviour, to the way we live. What is the resonance between my way of life and how I'm living, and how I deal with problems and situations and relationships with So again, rather conveniently, the seventh stage of contemplation is quite short. And it's a rather difficult one, I think, for contemporary people to understand. It seems a little esoteric or a little abstract, and maybe it is in some ways. It basically, he says that as we move along and through these stages of contemplation, you remember we move through the ascetical, we move through the sense of fallenness, of our own incapacities, our own limitations, our own problems. And then we move through the ascetical stages into a greater freedom of the heart, where we become capable of feeling contrition. It's as if our sensitivity, our spiritual sensitivity is restored or reawakened. And we begin to see the meaning of the purification of the heart. And in the fourth stage, we become able to the magnificence of the world, of creation, and the greatest wonder of all, the incarnation itself. So Christian faith, as it were, begins to flower within this experience of the beauty of creation. And self-knowledge and spiritual knowledge begin to develop together. Now, in this seventh stage, he says we begin to marvel not only at the beauties of the world and the diversity of creation, or at our own being, the depth and subtleties of our own existence, but we begin to marvel at the multiple states of being, the multitude of incorporeal powers which are beyond the material realm. So the angelic powers and thrones, the levels of reality, we would probably say, which we're not usually able to discern. They require too sensitive or a much more sensitive or a much more pure kind of vision to be able to be aware of them, although we may have a dim sense, a certain intuition that there are other layers and levels of being. But to focus upon the mystery of Christ, and we are taught that it's through the practice of detachment that we are able to experience this mystery of Christ for ourselves, not only through books or but in the scriptures we are able to discover the hidden meanings, the hidden mysteries, and the mystery of Christ himself. And then in the fifth stage, we are introduced to the idea of impermanence, that the changeable nature of all created things is something that makes us reflect upon the meaning of death, to become mindful of death, and to discover that by practicing the mindfulness of death in the right way, we overcome our weakness, our fear, our tendency to postpone or to avoid. In the sixth stage, after we have learnt the habit of detachment, we discover strength, the ability to look on beauty without passion, without attachment, to withdraw our positive and negative attachments from things, and to be moved, therefore, along into the contemplation of nature, as we discover our own capacity for divinization. And this is the real awakening of the sense of wonder, the wonder of the